going on and it has gone on in their lives is real, and it's here for us to learn by. That's why these things are recorded in the scripture, that we may believe. John wrote this particular epistle that we may believe that Jesus is the Christ, the Son of God. That what the Christ done, what the Son of God does, not only does he come to seek and to save that which is lost, but ultimately one day that all mankind, those that are dead, those that are living, that everybody will stand before the Son of God and have to give account to what goes on. And gang, this is why we come here this morning, to receive the grace and the mercy, the hope, the forgiveness of sin, so that we can continue to endure, that we can continue to walk, and that we don't walk contrary to Christ. And when that day comes where we stand before Jesus, that therein there is great expectation and great joy, and not a dreadful fear of knowing that, oh man, I jacked this whole thing up. I lived X, Y, and Z, and now what, man? And so these people that are called here, these men that are called, ultimately we know that Jesus calls 12 disciples, 12 apostles. They will become the apostles. But as he calls 12, of these 12 men, 7 of them were fishermen. Now, when you and I think about fishermen here today, maybe you've got a crazy story. I think I have a crazy story or two. In fact, this might be a great time to share that story. But fishermen, 7 of these guys were fishermen. When Jody and I were in San Diego, when we lived in San Diego, early on in following and serving Jesus, that we used to minister to gangsters, literally, the little Hispanic gangster kids, like teenagers, young 20s, and all this stuff. And that was part of the group that we were with. And what we did one time, we had an outing, and the group of us, we rented this half-day boat thing to take the kids out on a half-day fishing trip out there in the San Diego, just off the coast there in the ocean. And so we went out, and Channel 10 News was doing a special and a piece on it. So we had a news crew on there. We probably had about 50 kids, and then just us as chaperones and all that stuff. And so we're trolling out to the spot that we're going to be fishing for the day. And as we're going out, they start letting us fish on different spots, and Jody starts fishing off the back of the boat as we're kind of making our way out. And if you've ever been behind a boat, you know that behind the boat, there's a wake behind the boat, right? The kind of the white water that comes up at the back of it. She's fishing. Everybody's just kind of chilling around there and watching. And she's learning how to do this fishing thing and all that. And the next thing you know, you see her pole go, whook, and she's pulling like this. And we're going, you got to be kidding me. We're not even there. And she's caught something. Amazing. So everybody gets up, and they start crowding around and watching her, and there she is, and the little news camera is doing its deal or whatever, and Jody's reeling this thing in. The deckhand guy is there, and what lands, or what is, it didn't land, it was already there, is a, what's that big thing called? Pelican. There it is. Yeah, sorry, I had to ask. A pelican was right there. And every time she's pulling this thing in, that stupid pelican would go, it'd go down under the water. And it happened like 3 or 4 times. So she's cranking this thing in, it gets it all the way up right there to the boat and everything. And here's the kicker of the whole story. She caught the pelican. The pelican had the bait in her mouth, and it wasn't a fish. Man. So she had a call. She was trying to get some fish, and she ended up with a pelican, okay? Listen, the calls that Jesus puts upon our life, there's different calls that we see here. But we're serving the same God. And the way that we come to Jesus, there's so many different ways in which that happens. But as John writes here, as we've talked about before, that this particular gospel, that John puts it in a way that he focuses upon the deity of Christ. And focusing upon the deity of Christ, some of the theological aspects or the terms or the shaping of all that, of what he puts out there, is different than Matthew, Mark, and Luke. The synoptic gospels is totally different than those guys, because the way that he focuses on doctrine is nothing more than the beliefs that we hold and the things that the church is to continue to teach and hang on to. He puts it out there in a way that he gives the what with the miracles and the working of Christ, and he gives the why by the 7 I am statements of Jesus, and kind of connects it with people's lives. And so we love John because of the way he did this, but he answers and he gives us the what and the why. And as we're going to see here today through this particular study, that the call that goes out to men and women, different calls here through the pages of Scripture, and yet he meets people at the intersections of their life. And I want you to know that here this morning, that whatever intersection that you're at in life here this morning, whether it's great success, great failure, contemplation, doubt, just in that place of just trying to go for discovery and see what this thing is all about, maybe you're church shopping, looking for the right place for you and your family, whatever your story is here today, please understand that Jesus desires to meet you at the intersections of your life. And that's so comforting here to me, because I know that wherever I show up, that there he is. Verse 43, one more time. It says, the following day, Jesus wanted to go to Galilee, and he found Philip, and he said to him, follow me. So Andrew, John, these guys here, back up in the preceding verses, verse 35, we know that that was the start of the third day, and those guys followed Jesus, and they hung out with him overnight. They stayed there. They stayed the night with him. And John gave us the details of that last week. But now as we come here today, verse 43, we start the fourth day. And we know this, that by reading the Gospel of Matthew, that the way John positions this, it can almost feel like this is the first interaction that Jesus has had with these guys. It's not the case. Jesus has already interacted with these guys. But at this stage of the game, he's calling them to step out into a deeper commitment, into deeper water with him, if you will, stepping up into places of service. And man, this got me thinking about my life, because I had a radical conversion. Most of you know that story. You know, I came to faith on May 7th, 1993, about 8 o'clock at nighttime. It was radical, had a gun in my mouth. And I began to follow the Lord. But it wasn't until February 22nd of 2007, when I was in the intern pastor program, down in Calvary Chapel, Castle Rock there, that God invited me to the next step of what he was doing into my life. And as I remember going into the building that night, coming into the side door, reaching out, pulling the door to walk in, and the Lord just ministered to my heart. It's like, boom, God spoke. Wow, what? Lord, what? He says, you're going to be a pastor. And I tripped out in that particular moment. I'm going, I ride a Harley. I'm not the most finesse guy. I like MMA, so I enjoy rolling around and wrestling with people and all that stuff. And when I grabbed the door to go in, I just, all in that moment, all the thoughts, all the emotions that just came over me was like, there's no stinking way. And yet God was inviting me to a deeper walk with him, to a deeper surrender that my life might be used by him. Well, 5.5 years later, September 13th of 2012, wasn't all that time went by before the fulfillment of that happening, that okay, he made me a full-time pastor and he put me into full-time ministry. But there was a 5.5-year gap in that span of what the Lord spoke to me in 2007 and what he actually brought to pass in 2012. It was amazing. So the what and the why. The what that God called me, the why, which I wrestled with, because it was accompanied with this time of waiting, this delay, this time of preparation, if you will, that God was still doing the work upon me. And so here's what I want you to hold on this morning, just from verse 43 as we get going. That God's up to something great in your life right now. Right this very second, God is up to something great in your life. Yes, my life too, but your life. This is personal. I'm not just up here just telling stories about what God has done in my world. We're not up here just reading the stories about what God has done in these people's world. God is up to something in your world, in your life. He's doing something great right now. Now, you might not see the results of it until down the road, until a time and a season passes. And that could be a short time in a season, or it could be an extended time. But understand that God is not slack concerning his promises, and he's at work in your life. You know, I was thinking about it this morning in my own personal devotion here before church, before I left the house. That, man, if I could give you something, if I could encourage you in something regarding the call of God, regarding the delays of God, regarding all of this, is to remain faithful. Just remain faithful. Whatever it is, whether you have the fruit of what you think should be or you don't have the fruit of it, if God has given you something, hang on to it and don't change. Don't turn to the left, don't turn to the right. You know, Matthew 26, it shows us a powerful example of Peter, of him in this place of arguing with Jesus. Lord, I'm not going to deny you. Even if everybody denies you, I'm not going to deny you. And I think we can learn from that Number one, hanging on to what God's up to and not arguing with Jesus. You know, I argued with Jesus in my heart when I reached out to grab that door February 22nd of 2007 and coming into the side door of Calvary Chapel, Castle Rock, and God said, you're going to be a pastor. It's like, Lord, no. That's not true. You know, was it a Jonah moment? I don't know, where I went the opposite direction of what God wanted to do? Perhaps. But God had to weed some stuff out of me. Because it might be cool for some pastors to go around and to drop, you know, high kicks and gives them good, powerful elbows in an MMA wrestling match or whatever. That wasn't what he had for me as a pastor. So he worked some of that stuff out of my life by way of age and just getting old, and my bones hurt now, so I can't do that as much. But he prepared me. And the lesson is that, man, I'm not supposed to argue with Jesus, that all the calls that come out, I need to just remember that when Jesus speaks something, it's for me to obey. Another thing is in the aspect of just holding on to the promises, is of understanding that I'm not to stop praying. I'm not to stop praying for vision, for direction, for the working hand of God to complete what he began. That I partner with God in that. And when I know that I'm partnering with God and I'm praying for his will to be done, I know that it's going to come to pass, and he's going to carry me, he's going to give me the hope, and he's going to put the right expectations within my heart for the right time. But the pitfalls that can happen to all of this is that if I begin to leg back and follow at a distance like what Peter did before he blew it from the Lord, the prayerlessness led to a denial, and then him following at a distance and warming himself at the fire in the enemy's camp, if you will, that God doesn't want me to do that. He doesn't want me to leg back. He wants me to understand that he has a very specific call for me. Well, verse 44 goes this way. He says, now Philip was from Bethsaida, the city of Andrew and Peter. And so Bethsaida has been translated a few ways, but basically it's house of the fishermen. And so we find Philip here from Bethsaida, house of the fishermen. It reminds us of a few things, that over in Matthew chapter 4, that Jesus is there and he puts a call out to Peter and Andrew, and he tells them, he says, listen, I'm going to make you fishers of men. This call to service. And gang, that's what we as the church are. We are fishers of men. Follow with me to your left to the very last chapter of the Gospel of Matthew. Only about 30 pages or so, maybe 40 to your right. I'm sorry, to your left, not your right. I'll get you all lost here. So Matthew 28 there, the closing chapter. This is after the death, the resurrection, and right here before the ascension of Christ. And he's talking to his disciples. And he says in Matthew 28, actually I'll start in verse 18. Jesus speaking to them, he says, all authority has been given to me in heaven and on earth. And now he tells them, he says, go therefore and make disciples of all the nations, baptizing them in the name of the Father and of the Son and of the Holy Spirit, teaching them to observe all things that I have commanded you. And lo, I am with you always, even to the end of the age. And so going forward and making disciples, that is the call. And what happens back in our text is, you can flip back there real quick. What happens back in our text is we go to verse 45 and 46, we find that Jesus shows up there in Bethsaida. He calls Philip. Philip begins to follow, and immediately what happens? What does Philip turn around and do? Verse 45, Philip found Nathanael, and he said to him, we have found him of whom Moses in the law and also the prophets wrote, Jesus of Nazareth, the son of Joseph. The call. The call has gone out to our lives that we would respond to the gospel message. The Holy Spirit continues to call us into deeper water, into deeper areas of service and sacrifice and commitment unto the Lord. And whether you've been following Jesus for one day or 100 years, it doesn't change that the responsibility, that the response for us as Christians is that we're to be making disciples. Now, when I say that, and I'm putting myself back into my early days of walking with Jesus, the first year, the first 5 years, the first 10 years, the first 15 years even, man, I would get all weirded out on that. It's like, But Lord, and I find myself in that spot of just arguing with the Lord. The calls that go out, God uses each one of us. For those of you that were here and you saw Case for Christ on Friday night when we did the movie night, you know that you saw a very real story played out in a docudrama here on the screen, that what Lee Strobel wrestled with was the existence of God. He was a committed atheist and so forth, and yet over the course of time, God did a work. He reached down and grabbed his wife first, and his wife begins to pray for him and all these different things, and the work just continued on. And now God uses Lee Strobel as a mighty vessel in a powerful way of sharing his story. And gang, the same simple truths are true for us, because there's people in our lives that we are called to pray for. And we're called to make disciples. And the first thing that Philip did when Jesus said, hey, follow me. Jesus had called him into a deeper place of service. That Philip goes out and he found Nathanael. Look at verse 46 now. It says, and Nathanael said to him, can anything good come out of it? I read over on chapter 2, the parallel I know. Can anything good come out of Nazareth? ? There it is. And Philip said to him, come and see. I love this. It's a simple truth. Sheriff filled what he knew. Sheriff filled, I'm not. Yeah, maybe we're going to have to close the curtains in the back. These cars are getting me now. Philip shared what he knew. That's it. He just shared what he knew. But just by sharing a simple thing, it confronted Nathanael. Because Nathanael was a guy that was a religious dude. He was seeking God. And I don't use the term religious in a bad way here, okay? He was seeking God. But in Nathanael's personal prejudices within his own heart, that he drops a phrase, can anything good come out of Nazareth? Nazareth was an area where there was a lot of soldiers kind of on the outpost there. And the debauchery that was in the small little area, small little town of Nazareth, was something that was real. And so the only thing that Nathanael was communicating was his own personal prejudices of, dude, that stinking town, ain't nothing good coming out of that town. And there was a bias factor that was in his heart. But Philip didn't get into it with him. And when you confront biases in people's heart, because God is using you to minister to somebody else, you don't have to get into these wrestling matches and know all the details. Look what Philip said right here. At the very end of verse number 46, all he said was, come and see. He invited him to come and see. He didn't have all the answers. He didn't give him all the answers. He didn't contend with him. He didn't try to convince him out of his own personal prejudices. He just said, come and see. Now I want to challenge you. And I want you to go to your adult life, not your adolescent years. In your adult life, for those of you, I'm hoping there's somebody in here besides me and Jody that came to Jesus in your adult life. But the first time you came into the sanctuary and somebody's ministering to you and you show up at church, what was your experience like? Did you experience the presence of God? Did you sense the power of the Holy Spirit just tapping on your heart, knowing, wait a minute, God's in this place and he wants to do something here. He wants to do something in my life. Because that was my experience. And we resisted, and I say we, both Jody and I, we resisted what God was up to because we had this group of Christians ministering to us. They took us to church. We hung out with them on their little barbecue things. And you know what? For a year and a half, we struggled with doing the opposite thing. We couldn't come to that place of letting our guard down. We couldn't come to that place of just surrendering our will. But one thing's for certain. When I saw those people in church raising their hands, when I heard the word, or I saw the words on the screen and would hear the people worshiping, man, I knew that there was a God and I sensed something. I wasn't a Christian at that point. And Philip says, come and see. Come and see. Now, verse 47 takes us deeper because Jesus saw Nathanael coming towards him, and he said of him, behold, an Israelite indeed, in whom is no deceit. So this word deceit, This is something that Isaac, that he spoke about his son, Jacob. That all the way back in Genesis 27, verse 35 there, that Jacob, with the help of his mom, deceived his dad for the blessing. And the language that is used there, actually the little English word that we have in our text is that deceit. That Isaac was telling Esau that, man, Jacob deceived me in this. He's got the blessing. He's taken it away. And we find that in the chapters to come following after that, that Jacob knew that he was a manipulative guy. He knew that he walked contrary to God in many ways. He knew that the problems upon his own life and the things that he was wrestling with as he was fixing to be confronted by Esau, his brother, and the nerve-wracking stuff that was going on and the stress and the pressure that was inside of him the night before, he gets into this thing where he's pleading with God. He's wrestling with God. He's pleading with God in this thing. God, have mercy upon me. And he wasn't given up until God helped him and answered his prayer. And it was in that time, we find it in Genesis 32 and 28, that Jacob went from this place of being the deceiver, Jacob, to experiencing a blessing from God. His name was changed to Israel, and he ends up being a guy that is governed by God. And it's a powerful thing. Because each one of us wrestle with God in the different aspects of what we experience as we navigate through life. Sometimes it's in the situations that we're wrestling with God for understanding, for help, for even a changing of the situations. Other times we're in this place where we're wrestling with our own sin. We don't understand it. We get so frustrated with ourselves. Why do I keep doing the same thing over and over and over and over again? God, are you not real? Do you not hear my prayer? And we struggle with all of these things, the things that go on with our kids, the things that we wrestle with personally. It's like, God, we just want change in all of this stuff. And we're not to give up on God. God hears. Sometimes there's a very practical thing that we can do by just simply changing the habits and the accountability factor. Well, verse 48 picks up. And it says, Nathanael said to him, how do you know me? So Nathanael speaking to Jesus, how do you know me? Jesus says, before Philip called you, when you were under the fig tree, I saw you. It's a special time of devotion. Being under the fig tree in biblical language, this would represent somebody that was a seeker of God. And there he was, under the fig tree, having that time of devotion. We're reminded of a couple things. First thing is this, out of Psalm 139, that we've got the picture of God's all-seeing eye. And in Psalm 139, scholars put that title on it, the omnipresence of God, the all-seeing eye of God, that he knows everything. And what scholars take out of from verse 48 all the way down through 51 here in this little exchange is that this is something that was very personal that was happening here with Nathanael. Because as Jesus sees him coming, Jesus, as God, goes to that place and he recounts and he speaks those particular things that Nathanael and only Nathanael would know the full impact of. And scholars say this about Nathanael, that they think that he was sitting there under the fig tree, place of contemplation, prayer, thinking about the scriptures and so forth, of thinking back to this exact thing here in Genesis 27, 28, all the way to 32, where the wrestling aspects of going on is with Jacob and what God did. And the name that was put on this thing in the Old Testament scriptures is that the deceit of Jacob was there. And as Nathanael is sitting here under the fig tree and having just coming from this place of saying, hey man, he was confronted by Philip. Philip says, hey man, come and see. Can anything good come out of Nazareth? He says, come and see. And what he was chewing on already was about the deceit aspect. It was on his mind. But when Jesus sees him and he looks at him, he says, he nails it right to the core. An Israelite indeed, in whom is no deceit. And he tells him, when you were under the fig tree, Philip, I saw you. Gang, God sees when you pray. God sees when you seek him. God knows when you're driving down the road and it's that little silent prayer that goes up. God knows. God knows the motivation of your heart. God knows all the things that are going on. And none of this stuff is passed over by God. It's special to him. And many times I think that we can just move beyond it without taking note of it from God's vantage point. God sees it. Now, verse 49 and 51 go this way. Nathanael answered and he said to him, Rabbi, you are the Son of God. You are the King of Israel. Jesus says, because I said to you, I saw you under the fig tree. Do you believe? You will see greater things than these. Most assuredly, I say to you, hereafter you shall see heaven open, and the angels of God ascending and descending upon the Son of Man. So the completion of all of that. You know, this picture out of Genesis 28, man, this goes back to Jacob's ladder. You know, Jacob, the deceiver, having had the Abrahamic covenant and the promise passed down and all that stuff, there he goes out to this new land and this new place, and he falls asleep one night, and he uses a rock as a pillow, and he's in this spot of sleeping on the pillow, and he's not aware that God is in this place, that God is doing a work around him, that God is bringing him to a particular thing to inherit the particular promises, the goodness of God. And he lays down and he has this dream, and in this dream he sees the angels of God ascending and descending upon a ladder. And it means nothing more than this, is that God was actively at work in spite of who Jacob was. And the simplicity of this spills into our lives. But one more thing before I complete that thought. Because in verse number 51, what Jesus says, hereafter I say to you, that you're going to see heaven open and the angels of God ascending and descending upon, watch, the Son of Man. So in Genesis 28, verse 12 and 13, it is ladder. Jacob's ladder, as we often refer to it. But quite frankly, as Jesus speaks it here, he says, upon the Son of Man. And we know this, that the link between heaven and earth is only through Jesus. He's the way, the truth, and the life, and no man comes to the Father except by him. And we take up in the background of all the stuff that was going on here as Jesus is calling his disciples, Andrew, John, Peter, Philip, Nathanael here. The backdrop of all of this stuff is that God stepped out of eternity. He came down here, planted his feet on the ground, took on humanity, 100% God, 100% man. He's walking these things out. And in the background of Nathanael's life, God is saying, Jesus is saying, man, I've seen where you've been. I'm already actively at work. I've already met you before this day has begun. I've already gone into this day. I already know what's going on. But understand that it's all going to happen through me. And everything that you go through within your life, that you're in God's grip of grace. If you're a believer in Jesus Christ here this morning, you're in God's grip of grace. If you're not a believer in Jesus Christ here this morning, understand that the same way that Philip and the same way that the rest of the Christians throughout the church age are to go out and to make disciples, you're not here by accident. Whether it's by a personal invite or the work of the Holy Spirit, you sit here today and you hear the gospel message that God desires to take away your sin and to bless you. And Nathanael discovered, even though he had these prejudices about, man, can anything good come out of Nazareth? Just like Jacob, he discovered that God was up to something. And so the point and the title of our message, the different callings. So as I tighten up our application here as we close now, I want to ask you, how are you called? How are you called? Because when we survey the rest of the Gospel of John, and we're going to see this in the weeks to come, that in John chapter 4, we're going to come across the woman that Jesus met at the well. He went out of his way to meet this woman at the well up in Samaria. And this gal had 5 husbands. So think about that with me. Whether it's in our culture today, but way more in that culture back then, that she was an outcast, that she was carrying a lot of shame. Yeah, she had this tough exterior that was there to protect the fragility and the sensitivity that was going on because of all the fractured pain of what she'd experienced. But Jesus met her. And he gets right to the root of the problem as he's interchanging and interacting with her. And he goes right to that place. Oh, Jesus, you did not do that. You did not go to her personal relationships. You did not just drag out that she's had 5 husbands and the one that she's with now is not her husband. Yeah, he did do that. He spoke to the root of the problem. The woman in John chapter 8, the woman caught in the very act of adultery. Another example of the call of God going out. And this particular woman, she'd fallen prey to a man. And so often in our society, we find that there are those men that use women for sex, and they never stand up and they never marry them. They keep them loaded down with sins. They keep them locked in this place to where, yeah, we're living together. Yeah, we got a house together. Yeah, we're doing life together. But you know, they never stand up and take that leadership as a man, and they're robbing that woman of her treasure. And so too this woman in John chapter 8, as she was called by Jesus in that point, that God pulled her away from the guy that didn't take responsibility. And in the middle of the religious critics of the day, Jesus says, I don't condemn you, man. I love you. Go and sin no more. He gave her very specific directions of embracing her and sending her out for the point and the purposes of doing what is right and pleasing in God's eye, and also it was protection. When we follow God's will, it's protection within our life. When we disregard God's will, understand this, that whatever we sow, that will we also reap. And we think it's no big deal. But I'm going to tell you by personal experience, and I don't say this in a pride capacity, but I say it is more in a capacity that I'm embarrassed for the way that I've lived so much of my Christian life. Because having known what is right, it seems like there's been those seasons in my life where I've fallen prey to my flesh and I've done those things that are contrary to Christ. And I want to tell you that at every departure of faith, there's a scar to bear. And you may not immediately experience that, but rest assured as God brings the sun up and as sure as God causes the sun to set, there's a scar to bear from every departure of faith. If you're a Christian, there's a scar to always bear. Now I want you to turn. We're still here in Gospel of John, but turn a couple pages to your right to John chapter 5. Because I want you to be able to at least note this one down or remember the reference point. John chapter 5, that we get to a story here of a man, John 5 and 5, that this dude was caught in a place of some sort of disease, sickness, infirmity is what the scripture says, for 38 years. And Jesus goes up here to the pool of Bethesda, and he comes and he talks to this guy. And at the bottom of verse number 6, Jesus says, do you want to be made well? There Jesus is. He's speaking to the core issue. This was no surprise to the Son of God that this dude had been jacked up for 38 years. It was not a surprise to Jesus. But the surprise to you and I is that how bold Jesus is about this is he looks at this guy, and so often in the context of the language that we see in the Bible, or the language that perhaps sometimes we can use with each other, speaking to the core matter of an issue, that we can say, well, that's rude and insensitive. Not so. Not so. Jesus doesn't put Band-Aids on it. He doesn't just cover things over with peanut butter and jelly and say, it's all good, eat the burnt toast. It's not what he says. He says, let me give you some good toast. Let me take off that crustiness. And he went right to the core. He says, do you want to be made well? This is a dude that had gotten used to living in these particular conditions. And what is this guy's great sin? I don't know, man. But I think that by way of Jesus just asking this question here, that this dude was struggling with a place of remaining in the sin of excuses. He'd been paralyzed for 38 years, no doubt, continued to live in poor living conditions, but it was all because of excuses. And Jesus speaks to the heart of it. And I think so often we read through the scriptures and we don't slow down enough to go, wait a minute, what is Jesus doing? What does this matter? Why is he saying that? Do you want to be made well? It's because he was addressing the issue, the root cause of what was up, and why the dude never got better, because of his excuses. The final thing I want to remind you about is this. You can turn there. You don't have to. Also in the Gospel of John, chapter 9, that Jesus, he comes across a blind man. And in this interaction with the blind man, we learn that the disciples begin to ask some questions, or the people that are around asking questions. Man, who sinned? This guy or his parents? Why is he blind? And Jesus ends up doing a work. But the simple thing that I want to highlight for you, without exegeting this story, because we'll do it in the days to come, is that I want you to understand that God is able to overturn those situations that you were born into. The situations that are not your fault. The situations that have stigmatized your life, that has paralyzed your life, and that you've been so jacked up in. But there's a powerful point that we find in this story as Jesus cuts to the heart of it. He says, man, it was neither. It wasn't the parents and it wasn't the kid. Nobody sinned. But this is for the glory of God. But he tells the guy down in chapter 9, verse 7, he tells him very specifically, he spits on the ground, he puts some spit in his eyes, he makes some clay and all this stuff, and he says, go and wash in the pool of Siloam. The part of the healing process in this guy to be able to receive sight is that he was to obey by faith what Jesus told him to do. And you might be in a situation where you were born into some problems. But the only way to get out of this is by listening to what Jesus has said and responding by faith. Guys, I had such an explosive rage that it was within me. Many of you know that I experienced a sexual violation from a family member when I was about 6 years old, and coming through my young years and into adolescence and all that stuff, that, man, I went through a situation that was not my fault. But what resulted in me is my response to that pain was a rage. And I carried for so many years until Jesus set me free at age 21. I carried that pain as an excuse to explain my rage and why I would hurt others. It was an excuse. Never letting it go. Never surrendering it to God. And I wrestled with the very people that God put in my life for a year and a half, because God saw the pain. He saw it was getting worse. He saw I was so derailed. I was jacking up a brand new marriage, Jody and I. Almost destroyed our first year of marriage. Had it not been for Jesus, it would be done. But mentally and emotionally, I couldn't move forward because I experienced something that wasn't my fault. And that's where God met me. Listen, you might not see a way out of your situation here this morning. And there might be some delays in what you perceive to be God answering your prayers. But don't distance yourself from Jesus. Because every time I pushed off of Jesus, it just delayed that healing that he wanted to bring to my life. Healing, healing. He wanted to do it. And so whatever the call is that God is calling you in this morning, please understand, the Bible tells us this in 2 Corinthians chapter 6, verse 2. In an acceptable time I have heard you, and in the day of salvation I have helped you. Behold, now is the acceptable time. Behold, now is the day of salvation. And the whole point boils down to the call. All the different calls that we've seen in men and women. We see these fishermen being called. We see the acts of the different men and the gals here that we just looked at. All of these things. They're all calls. And I want to encourage you this morning is not to try to figure your way out of your own problems. Just respond to the call of God. God will help you. He will walk you through this stuff. And maybe if we could take the encouragement of Philip and what he said to Nathanael, again, a guy that was already seeking God but had these religious prejudices within his heart. All he said was, come and see. Come and see. Taste and see that the Lord is good. And that's what I invite you here to this morning. That you would come and see. Have Alyssa come back forward today.
Thanks for joining us today. If you want to know more about having a real relationship with God, click the Do You Know Him link under the Resources tab at westminstercalvary.org. We also would like to invite you to join us on Saturdays at 6 p.m. or Sundays at 10 a.m. We are conveniently located on the northeast corner of Wadsworth Parkway and Church Ranch Boulevard in the Stanley Lake Marketplace Shopping Center. For more information, please contact our church offices at 303-223-4640. Thanks and God bless.